I found this interview while browsing YouTube, and it's by a filmmaker named David Hoffman, who interviewed a lot of people in the 90s, especially people who grew up in and around the 60s. And he has this interview with a Vietnam War veteran. And this is one of the best and most fascinating interviews I've ever watched. This guy recounts his experience of what happened in Vietnam. And obviously, this relates to what we usually talk about on the channel. Vietnam was a war against communism, a war of aggression, in which tons of napalm were dropped on the people of Vietnam, and millions were killed, and most of the U.S. soldiers who came back did so with PTSD. And there was also a large anti-war movement that was sparked in the United States. So all these things are very relevant. And getting this primary experience, this firsthand experience from this guy, is very interesting. He talks about what was going on in the war, the enemy, as he was told, and some of the heinous atrocities that went on. So let's just watch the clip. I don't want to give too much away, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it.
And then I was there for on the third day I was there, this guy who had picked me up in the Jeep, a corporal who I was ultimately going to replace, he and I were in the battalion intelligence section. We were sent down to the tractor park, the amphibious tractor park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to take care of prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They could be detained for questioning, which is why they were called detainees. And Jimmy and I went down there to the track park, and two tractors came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese up on top. High, flat-topped vehicles, about 8 or 9 feet tall. And as the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot so that they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. And I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. And I turned to Jimmy and I grabbed him by the arm and said, what are those guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people. And Jimmy turned to me and he looked at my hands on his arm. I sort of took them off and he said, "Earhart, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here." And I think it was at that point that I realized things were not quite what I was expecting. It went downhill from there. And again, I can't even begin to explain in the space of time that you have all of the things that went into it. But I began to understand, it became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us, and we were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. And day after day, our patrols went out, and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam. And yet our battalion during that same period of time sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month, over half of them resulting in casualties. This is for a unit of about 1,000 men. But there was no one to fight back at. And you begin to think, these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages and, you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place and you search it and you burn houses and blow them up. The common perception, the notion I had when I was in high school was that the Viet Cong terrorized the Vietnamese population, forced them to fight against the Americans at pain of death. What I began to understand in Vietnam was that they didn't need to do things like that. All they had to do was let a Marine patrol go through a village, and whatever was left of that village, they had all the recruits that they needed. I began to understand why the Vietnamese didn't greet me with open arms. Why they in fact hated me. But of course that didn't change the fact that my friends were getting killed and injured every day, and the only place that you could focus your own anger and fear was on those civilians who were there.
It's hard to even imagine the kind of suffering that was caused by the Vietnam War. And this is from the perspective of a U.S. troop, right? But there's documentaries and interviews you can find with Vietnamese people who were there. And it's a whole nother level for them, having Agent Orange and napalm dropped on their farms and on their homes, and having their homes blown up by U.S. airstrikes. So here's the historical context, of course. Vietnam is a tiny nation who's just gained their independence from the French. They've just won this great war of independence. They're looking to establish themselves, develop themselves, and immediately they are attacked by the largest military in the world, the United States, who launch a full invasion, saying they need to stop the spread of communism, that communism is such a dangerous and horrible ideology that we're willing to go to war to stop it from spreading. And the Vietnam War is launched against Ho Chi Minh, who immediately begins using guerrilla tactics, and these were tactics also used against the French, because the Vietnamese knew they did not have the firepower of the United States. The United States is the largest empire and largest military on the planet. Vietnam is a very small country that had just won its independence from a very brutal colonialism of the French. And they decide they have to use guerrilla warfare tactics. So they begin, because they know the land better than the American troops. So they begin, as this soldier says in his interview, mining and sniping and hiding and mining and sniping, to the point where the U.S. troops no longer know who the enemy is. Because the enemy could be hidden as civilians, the enemies could be in the trees. As he said, he saw 4 enemy combatants the first however long he was there, and they were sniped and mined something like 70 times. So the Vietnamese were hiding and looking to slowly win this war of attrition against the United States. And this is when you see the human rights abuses and the dropping of tons of Agent Orange and napalm start for the United States. You hear about them there launching an airstrike at an entire village because maybe the sniper fire came from the village. You hear about the soldiers throwing prisoners off with their hands and feet bound because they had developed this hatred for the people in general, because they never knew where they were going to be attacked from. There's a story that troops tell about Vietnam where a woman walks up holding a baby and saying she needs help, and then the soldiers look and it's a bomb. Because, as this soldier says, it wasn't the Vietnamese government coercing their people to hate the United States, as these young troops were told. They were being told there's this authoritarian communist dictatorship, they're forcing their people into slavery, and we need to go free them. And this guy thought he was going to be welcomed with open arms. But in fact, so many people were being recruited to Ho Chi Minh's forces because they had watched their homes be burned. They had watched Agent Orange and napalm dropped on their food supply. They had watched brothers, sisters, family members, husbands, wives, moms, dads be killed by the brutal actions of the United States. This country who they had never attacked, who they had never even wanted beef with. Ho Chi Minh used to read the Constitution and say, this is a great document. I wish the United States would actually live up to what's in this document. You know, the right to life and whatnot. Yet here they are saying we're a country founded on the right to life, murdering millions of people who never attacked us to stop the spread of communism. And as this troop says, the only thing you need to recruit more soldiers to Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla forces is to send a Marine Corps troop through a Vietnamese village, because they're going to massacre so many civilians and burn so many homes that people are going to watch that happen. They're going to go join the resistance battle. And you can imagine the kind of mental state that this puts the U.S. troops in, right? Who have been tricked, deceived by the media into thinking they're going to be welcomed by these people as liberators, thinking that they're going to be welcomed with open arms, and then getting there and seeing that, in fact, the U.S. is airstriking these people's homes, dropping napalm on their farms, and what the kind of mental state that creates. As he says, the only thing you can do is try and survive and tell yourself that these people are the enemy, all of them. You don't know where their actual troops are. You don't know whether their civilians might be enemy combatants or not. So the only thing you can do to survive is just convince yourself that these people are the enemy. And so many people came back with PTSD from Vietnam. And, you know, of course, the U.S. were the aggressors in this war. And Vietnam did what they had to do. But the U.S. troops who were sent here were victims too. This is, people who were tricked, fighting against people defending their country, and ultimately the rich are pulling the strings because they didn't want this ideology of communism spreading to where Vietnam would get the idea that they can use their resources to develop themselves rather than for the enrichment of Western multinationals. And millions of people died. And Vietnam is still recovering from the Agent Orange and napalm that we dropped on them over 50 years ago at this point. And the reasoning for this war, as I keep reiterating, there were mineral wealth, or there were minerals and resources in Vietnam that U.S. companies didn't want to lose. But the main justification was to stop the spread of communism, right? This evil ideology of communism. But wait, let's take a step back here. Let's forget all the brainwashing and Red Scare propaganda we've internalized about communism. So you have a communist nation who just won independence and are talking about developing themselves, and bringing their people out of poverty. And then there's a capitalist nation, much larger, the richest nation in the history of the planet with the world's largest military. And in order to stop the small nation from becoming communist, the capitalist nation launches a military assault on them, burning their villages to the ground, murdering millions of them, including civilians, and dropping metric tons of napalm and Agent Orange on their food supply and on the forests that populate the region, and their country still hasn't recovered today. So who's evil? Is it the communists? Is it the communist country who didn't do anything to anyone? Other than Pol Pot? That's the only country Vietnam invaded? Or the United States, or the capitalist country? Because I've been told my entire life that communism's evil, when I live in a capitalist country where 78% of people live paycheck to paycheck, and anytime a country tries to develop themselves, we bomb the shit out of them. So I'm starting to think that capitalism's the evil ideology, and these communists have had it right all along. So yeah, the last thing I want to talk about is the anti-war movement that was sparked because of Vietnam, because there really was, and it's thought of as this kind of hippie movement, in these protests, like, we need peace. But an interesting media and political aspect of this is the Vietnam War was the first war to be really televised, right? The mainstream news was playing what's actually going on in Vietnam. Here are the bombings. Here's the Agent Orange. Here's the napalm. Here's the experience of the soldiers who are there. This is when television is still fairly new. And this giant backlash sparks. Like, what are we doing here? We're invading these people because they're communist? Why do we get to tell them how to run their government? Why do we get to kill millions of their civilians because we think we have the right to govern them? That makes no sense. And this anti-war movement has started. Ever since then, you guys, the military has really cracked down on what you're allowed to film. So the media can no longer go in there, investigate exactly. I mean, do you know what's going on in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria unless you've done investigative journalism on your own and really dug into it deeply? Do you see that on the mainstream news, what the U.S. is doing in these places? Unless maybe you talk to a troop who who was there, and trust me, they will reveal some incredible things that are going on in the U.S. foreign interventions. No, we don't see it, which is partially why we haven't had as much opposition to these interventions. They go under the radar. They're sort of secret hidden wars, equally or close to as deadly. Millions of people are dying. Entire regions are being destabilized. And U.S. troops are getting PTSD. The Taliban are a guerrilla force in the Middle East, similar to the Viet Minh. But we don't see it. And there's no substantial anti-war movement right now because people aren't even aware this is going on, that millions of people are still being killed with your tax dollars, and young Americans are being sent, be patriotic, fight for your country, spread democracy, and then they come back with PTSD and get no help from the government. So yeah, check out our interview with Nat Shannon. It's on here. She's a social worker it's on our YouTube. She's a social worker who works with veterans. And yeah, just remember that U.S. troops sometimes are victims too, even though they're part of the world's most deadly war machine. And never forget who the true enemy is. The true enemy are the capitalists who are sending young people to fight and die in murderous wars to stop the spread of communism and to monopolize all the wealth on this planet. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching that cool interview with me. I'll see you next time.